Hey, we're back. And we're going to start chapter 10, which is called The Age of Jackson. The Age of Jackson. Section 1 is called Jacksonian Democracy, and it starts on page 322, so let's get right into it. America in the early 1800s is changing fast. In the North, where there were once workshops run by craftspeople with a few employees, those were being quickly replaced by large-scale factories owned by business people and staffed by hired workers. This is a big change that's going to become very important later on. In the South, another change that's going to become very important later on is that small family farms begin to give way to much larger farms known as plantations, typically to grow cotton. Those plantations owned by wealthy white people and worked by African American slaves. Wealth seemed to be concentrating into fewer hands. We talk about this, you hear about this a lot in the news today, the 1%. And whatnot, and that continues to be a problem. Why is it that a few people have most of the wealth? Well, it's kind of been that way throughout history, and it's no different here in America, and it wasn't any different back then. It doesn't mean it's right, but I'm just saying it is what it is. Most ordinary Americans, pardon me, most ordinary Americans are really starting to feel left behind during this time period. And they began to feel that they were losing power in their own government. In the 1700s, there were groups of Americans who thought that the government was best managed by wealthy men who owned their own property. And government policies, because of that, were targeted to help those wealthy men continue to keep their wealth and keep their power. The result was, in America, that there was this growing belief that the wealthy were tightening their grip, that they were excluding other people. And it's kind of interesting because you read that in the book and you hear me say it and you're like, that's not that different than what we're feeling now. History is cyclic, and we can learn a lot from it if we pay attention to our own history and to the history of other countries as well. So, there are people that are hoping for change. So, small farmers, frontier settlers, slaveholders, all of these people rallied behind Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was, as you will no doubt remember from our last chapter, a very popular war hero from the War of 1812, and he was a presidential candidate in 1824. A lot of people voted for Jackson because they believed that he would defend the rights of the people and the slave states. They were very disappointed when he lost the 1824 election because of the way he lost. Because of the decision in the House of Representatives. And you remember me saying that Jackson accused Henry Clay of making a corrupt bargain in the House to get John Quincy Adams elected and then to get himself installed in the cabinet. And so a lot of the people who voted for Jackson were very angry about that. During the time that Jackson was at the height of his popularity, there were a lot of democratic reforms being made. Different states changed the qualifications for voting to grant more white males suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote. And they made it easier for people who didn't own property to vote. But these new voting rules typically excluded free blacks from voting, and prior to that, free blacks had been able to vote. They also began holding something called nominating conventions. Now, we're kind of at the tail end of that because we're about to have a presidential election next fall. And we've had our nominating conventions where we get, we're voting in our primaries right now, and then the nominating convention usually happens in the summer before the election. I don't know that they'll happen this year. We know that President Trump is the Republican nominee, and as of right now, it looks like Joe Biden will be the nominee for the Democratic Party. But they had these nominating conventions where party members would choose who was going to run for that party. This period of expanding democracy became known as Jacksonian democracy, named after Andrew Jackson. So, in the election of 1828, Jackson's supporters were absolutely determined that their candidate would win this election. We're not going to lose another election again. So they formed what they called the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party supported Jackson's candidacy. Now, I would like to state one more time that just like people change over the course of their life, political parties change over the course of their lives as well. And so when we talk about the Democratic Party and later on the Republican Party, they're not exactly the same now as they were back then, and that's to be expected. But this Democratic Party supported Andrew Jackson's candidacy. People who were backing President John Quincy Adams called themselves National Republicans. So, 1828, we have a presidential election, and it was a rematch of the 1824 election. We have John Quincy Adams, who is the incumbent, that means he's president and running again, versus Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson chose a man named John C. Calhoun. You may have heard of him before. John C. Calhoun to be his vice presidential running mate. John C. Calhoun will continue to be very important in American history in some good ways and some not so good ways. And we'll talk about him more as we get closer to the Civil War. The 1828 campaign focused on the personalities of the candidates. Jackson's campaigners, the people who wanted to get Jackson elected, described him as a war hero. They talked about how he was born poor and rose to success because he worked hard. If you look on page 325, you can actually see a little mini biography of Andrew Jackson. He was born in Waxhaw, a region along the border of North and South Carolina. He moved to Tennessee, which at the time was still part of North Carolina. And he worked hard. He had no formal education, but he taught himself and became a successful lawyer, which is very interesting to me. I'm always really fascinated by people who don't have a formal education and yet they end up sort of pulling themselves up somehow through sheer force of will. He became Tennessee's first representative to the U.S. Congress, served in the Senate. You know about him becoming a national hero when he defeated the Creek and the Seminole Indians and when he won the Battle of New Orleans. On the flip side, right, so you've got Jackson, who is being portrayed as a poor man who through his own hard work, pulled himself up by his own bootstraps and made something of himself. So you've got Jackson, and that's one picture. And then you've got John Quincy Adams, who was a Harvard graduate. His father was John Adams, the second U.S. president. And the way Andrew Jackson's supporters described John Quincy Adams was as being out of touch. He's one of those elites. He's out of touch with the common man. And what's funny is even John Quincy Adams's own supporters. One supporter of John Quincy Adams said that he was as cold as a lump of ice. He was a very reserved man. He was not extroverted. And so Jackson's supporters used that kind of against Adams in this election. On the other hand, the supporters of John Quincy Adams described Jackson as hot-tempered, crude, and ill-equipped. That means he didn't have what he needed to be president of the United States. How is somebody that's, this sort of crude and rude and doesn't conform to social norms, how is he going to be a good president for a whole country? In the end, ballots were counted, and Jackson won. He defeated Adams, and he won a record number of popular votes. Jackson won, you might say, in a landslide. Maybe not a landslide, but he won by quite a bit. So, Jackson is inaugurated, and his supporters saw his victory as a victory for the common man. He took his oath of office in front of this huge cheering crowd, and this crowd followed him back to the White House, and there was a big party on the White House lawn. In fact, it was such a raucous party that the police officers that were on hand had a hard time controlling the crowd. As president, Andrew Jackson believed in something called the spoils system. Now, you may have heard of a proverb, of a phrase that goes, "To the victor belong the spoils." Spoils of war are basically valuable things that you get to take if you are an invading country and you win. And so in American politics, what the spoils system was the practice of giving government jobs to political backers. Jackson was a big fan of this. He believed that I won, and so I'm going to give political jobs to my friends. The Secretary of State under Andrew Jackson was a man named Martin Van Buren. If you look him up, you will see that he has the most epic set of sideburns ever. And he ends up being president number 8 later on. But he was one of Jackson's strong allies in his official cabinet. Now, you remember that a presidential cabinet is the group of people that the president selects to head different departments and to be his advisors. So, for instance, Martin Van Buren was Jackson's Secretary of State. He would have had a Secretary of Treasury. He would have had Secretary of War. And, nowadays the presidential cabinet is huge. But President Jackson also relied a lot on a group of people that they called the Kitchen Cabinet. The Kitchen Cabinet was not the official presidential cabinet. This was an informal group of advisors that Jackson would get together to talk things over with. And because they often met down in the kitchens of the White House, that's how they got this name, Kitchen Cabinet. Jackson ended up being really, really important in American history for a lot of reasons, some of them not so great, and we'll talk about that in the coming sections. But he believed in a strong presidency, which meant he was loved on one side and hated on another side. In fact, he was the 7th president. In his presidency, he vetoed as many bills from Congress as all 6 presidents before him put together. We're going to talk about in the next section about the nullification crisis, and when that happened, Jackson threatened to send troops into South Carolina to force it to obey. So you've got a man who, for good or for bad, was a strong president who ushered in some really interesting developments in American history, and we will talk about that in our next section. Have a great weekend.